One of the more popular refrains in the manosphere that we've all heard for years is, "The wall defeats them all." This is, of course, referring to a near magical moment in the timeline of a woman's looks, whereby usually between 30 and 35, more specifically past 35, her looks wither and fade, and she enters into a time of great deprivation, and she can no longer secure men. Something along those lines. Now, this concept actually requires a bit of nuance, because the wall is real in a sense. Without a doubt, women's looks fade. All of our looks fade over time. As the great P.D. the Punani Slayer likes to say, given enough time, we all become sub-5s. But you could argue, because looks are women's primary asset, that it's even more important to them, and therefore, as their looks fade, they're worse and worse off, say, compared to men, relatively speaking. But the implication of the wall defeats them all is a kind of universal, axiomatic state of affairs whereby women reach 35 or 40, and then all the options dry up, there's nothing left for them. This, frankly speaking, couldn't be further from the truth. And a number of people have observed this. I'm not the first one. So we need to be honest that the wall, in a sense, exists. But how impactful is the wall actually when considering these things? For years, I've been observing things that have just run counter to that narrative, which, again, is repeated ad nauseum in the manosphere. The manosphere is and has become very hit or miss. Some things that are discussed and talked about are absolutely true. Much of what's discussed and talked about is predicated on half-truths, and some things just are not true, flat out, full stop, end of story. So the wall is one of those in-between truths. Now, is it actually true that women's options just dry up? Well, no, and this is something I've been observing for years now. Furthermore, I recently had an interesting conversation with a woman in her mid-50s who was sharing with me all these opportunities that were presenting themselves to her. And I kid you not, unless she was lying, which is possible, but from fetishists in their 20s, imagine a 55-year-old woman being approached by a 23 or 26-year-old guy. They're really into that sort of thing, when it turns out that she has a daughter that's close to 30, really weird. Men a couple of years younger, older men, everything you could imagine. Now, were the 55-year-old woman's options as great as they would be if she were 25? Obviously not. But she still had a lot of options. And over the past 2 years, she told me about all these experiences that she had with various men in ages, like I said, ranging from their 20s all the way up to their 70s. So what this actually tells us is this notion of Juggernaut law, which many of you might be familiar with, but Juggernaut law being the observation that regardless of how unattractive, how psychologically messed up, or even old a woman is, she'll be able to find someone, or indeed many men in some cases, that will take some level of interest in her. Now, you might say, yeah, sure, they'll be willing to bust a nut in her or whatever, and that's not necessarily the same thing as wanting to pursue a relationship, and that's true. A lot of these guys, at least based on information I have sourced from various people, including this woman, this middle-aged woman, have told me that, yeah, the primary objective there is just sexual contact, etc., etc. But a whole bunch of them also considered a serious relationship with her, including men in their 30s and 40s, as well as a fetishist in his 20s. So Juggernaut law, on some level, appears to be true. That is to say, women will always have a surplus of options, comparatively speaking, to men. And so, in that sense, the wall defeats them all just isn't true. So, what is it that actually defeats women? Why is it that many women end up unhappy, dissatisfied, etc., etc.? It's not the wall, we can observe, as we've just talked about this. It's not the fact that their looks have faded or that they have fewer options. No, of course they have fewer options. Sure, their looks have faded. Sure. What defeats women? It's not the wall. It's the same principle that, quote-unquote, defeats women, I don't even like the term to be honest, when they're young. The paradox of choice and their excessive choosiness. Because you see, as people tend to get older, they tend to carry baggage. Baggage from their childhoods. Baggage from being teenagers. Baggage from being a young person. Baggage from long-term relationships, divorce, from work, you name it. It all accumulates. It's like junk polluting their minds. And in the case of women, they actually start off less picky. As time goes on, they become pickier and pickier. By the time in their 50s, they really are picky. This woman turned down what appear to be very good options. Men her age who are well settled, good money, etc., etc. But there was one thing or another thing that she didn't find appealing, so she rejected them. So although the wall is a thing and women do get older and their looks fade over time just like everyone's, and they have fewer options than they did when they were in their prime, say between 18 and 25 to be very specific, it doesn't mean they have no options. Indeed, they still have many more options than men. What I find most interesting about this, though, is the question, I don't like framing it this way, but one might say nature or nurture. And I've had this discussion with a few friends, one in particular who is reasonably convinced that this isn't something deeply rooted in psychology, but rather a situation of circumstance. Women are very picky because by nature they typically have a lot more options, and everyone on average is pickier when they have a lot of options. When you have a lot of options, you take the opportunity to choose. And were the roles reversed between men and women in some hypothetical other dimension, let's say, where men had tons and tons of options and the scarcity principle would be reversed, well, in theory, men would be just as picky. Now, I don't think it's that extreme. I think when you have a situation that has been ongoing for, well, if you look at mammalian evolution, tens of millions of years, that certain psychological traits, as in men's greater libido, sexual resources being less accessible to them, and always having to vie for female attention, that over time, that became something baked into male psychology, which is to say, even if we were to flip the switch instantly and live in this hypothetical other dimension, even if men had all these options, would they become pickier? Probably, almost certainly. To the same degree as women? Almost certainly not, because male preferences have evolved over tens and tens of millions of years over the course of mammalian evolution, and you can't just do away with that with the flick of a switch. So yeah, everyone becomes pickier if they have a lot of options, but I do think as much as there would be some change, the baked-in differences are there. Women are psychologically underpinned by an extreme form of choosiness that not always, but oftentimes in a modern context can lead to personal unhappiness, misery, and the inability to settle. So yes, the options become fewer and fewer over time due to the quote-unquote wall, but they're still there. It's just that women, being as choosy as they are, find it more and more difficult to settle for a single individual man, which leads to rotation of partners and an inability to decide, the paradox of choice. They end up being unhappy, dissatisfied, because they passed up many opportunities, always banking on the possibility of getting something better. Because, look, I would argue that in the modern setting, at least to some degree, hypergamy is an evolutionary mismatch, because it's leading women to completely discount men when, on the face of it, objectively speaking, they are quite good catches. Like this 55-year-old woman turning down guys that were, frankly speaking, very well put together, whether financially, etc., kept good care of themselves. And she even admitted that she was on the fat side. So it's kind of astonishing, but it also doesn't surprise you. The wall defeats them all. Only kind of true, but not for the reasons that people claim, the people who insist on making use of this refrain. And Juggernaut law is probably true, but what really defeats women in the end is their hypergamy in a modern setting, coupled by their extreme pickiness and inability to make choices and stick with them. And so when you do get miserable, unhappy, middle-aged plus women, it's because of those reasons, not necessarily because their looks have faded, despite having a lot of options thrown at them, irrespective of their age and looks. As always, thanks for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons. You guys help support the channel, keep it going. Many thanks, much appreciated. If you could do the usual YouTube jazz, like the video, comment, share, subscribe, etc., that would be much appreciated too. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.